Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging headfirst into a topic that really touches everyone, yet often feels a bit mysterious: the world of local
Yeah,
governments.
how they're put together, right, how they got this way.
Exactly. And what in the world do they have to do with these massive global shifts like, urbanization or even climate change goals?
Right. We've pulled together a whole stack of your sources, articles, reports, research to sort of guide us through this.
Okay.
Our mission really is to cut through the complexity, pull out the most important insights, and help you understand not just the structures, but why they matter.
Hmm.
We're going to unpack how local administration works, trace its history, both in a specific country context and more globally. Look at the jobs they do
And connect the dots.
and connect the dots, yeah, to those big picture concepts.
And we promise some genuinely surprising facts along the way. Like, prepare to be a bit floored by how dramatically the number of local governments changed in one country relatively recently,
Oh, yeah.
or how two cities just, down the road from each other can be governed in fundamentally different ways. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand local government, we first kind of need to place it within the larger system, how a country is run.
Right.
And the sources highlight a fundamental distinction: unitary versus federal states.
So the way a country manages itself centrally sort of sets the stage for everything else.
Precisely. In a unitary state like Turkey, France, or the UK, the central government holds the ultimate authority. The administrative structure flows from there,
Okay.
typically organized into central government and local government. Federal states, on the other hand, think the USA, Germany, Switzerland, they have power formally divided.
Divided between central and subunits.
Yeah, between central or federal government and constituent subunits, like states or provinces.
And this structural difference directly impacts how power is distributed locally, right?
hmm
Which brings us to political versus administrative decentralization.
That's the key distinction here. Political decentralization is what you see more in federal states.
Oh, yeah.
The subunits, U.S. states, German Länder, Swiss cantons, they have a constitutionally granted semi-autonomous status.
Semi-autonomous.
Meaning it's not just administrative power. They can have their own legislative bodies, their own executive functions, even judicial systems separate from the federal level. Their power is, deeply secured by the Constitution itself.
But in unitary states, like Turkey, what happens there?
That's where administrative decentralization comes in. Local governments here, like municipalities, they're recognized as public legal persons. They have their own legal identity,
Okay.
but they are not part of the central administration's hierarchy. Their powers are executive or administrative only. They implement laws, but they don't make them.
Ah, implement, not create.
Right. And crucially, these powers are granted by ordinary law, not the Constitution.
Which means they could be changed more easily.
Potentially, yes, by the central government. The legislative and judicial power stays firmly with the center.
That's a really important distinction for, understanding where the power truly lies. So the sources actually spell out the core differences between federalism and this kind of decentralization.
They do. First, it's the scope of shared power. Federalism shares legislative, executive, and judicial power.
All three.
All three. Administrative decentralization shares essentially only executive or administrative power.
And the foundation of that power. You mentioned the Constitution versus law.
Exactly. In federalism, it's a rigid, often hard-to-amend constitution. In decentralization, it's ordinary law, making it feel less inherently protected.
And what about the entities themselves? Are local governments seen as states? Like a U.S. state?
No, local governments in both systems aren't sovereign states. They're units of administration.
Got it.
But in a federal system, the constituent parts, the U.S. states, the German Länder, are considered states with their own governmental branches, often their own constitutions.
Mm.
Local governments, they issue things like bylaws or regulations, but those always have to line up with higher laws and the Constitution. They can't contradict them.
And oversight is different, too, you mentioned.
Yes. In a unitary system with administrative decentralization, the central state has oversight over local governments. It's often called administrative supervision.
İdaresi.
In Turkish, exactly. Think of it as the center keeping watch, making sure local governments act within the law.
But not giving direct orders day to day.
Generally not on the day-to-day specifics, more about legality and conformity. In federalism, the federal government usually doesn't have this kind of direct administrative supervision over the federated states. Disputes tend to go through the high courts.
This raises a really important question then. Given these limitations, especially in unitary states, why bother with local governments at all? Why not just run everything centrally?
Well, the source makes it pretty clear. Administrative decentralization emerged because the central system just by itself couldn't effectively address or protect common local interests.
Too complex, too varied.
Exactly. Needs on the ground are just too varied, too specific for a single, distant bureaucracy to handle well.
Oh.
Local governments came about as, well, a necessary response to that reality.
Okay, let's zero in on Turkey's story then. Given its unitary structure and this idea of administrative decentralization, how did its local government tradition develop? What were the key turning points?
Well, the seeds were actually planted surprisingly long ago. You had local councils involved in provincial administration starting way back in the 18th century.
18th century, wow.
Yeah, it became more formalized in the mid-19th century and during the Tanzimat reforms, with bodies like the Muhasılık Meclisleri and later under the 1864 and 1871 Vilayet Nizamnameleri, the provincial regulations.
So these had elected locals?
They did include elected local representatives, yeah.
Yeah.
But the sources point out they weren't quite the same as modern local governments. They were more like early forms, laying the groundwork for the tradition.
So the idea of local input was there, but the structure was different. What about early attempts at actual municipalities, cities?
The Istanbul example is a classic one. There were regulations in 1857, 1868, aiming to create 14 municipal districts.
14.
Yeah, but interestingly, only one, the 6th municipal district covering Bielogolata, really got off the ground in an organized way.
And why that one?
Well, its main driver wasn't really about local democracy. It was more a focused effort to modernize the most sort of European part of the capital at the time.
And run by locals.
Actually, no. Its key officials were appointed by the center, not elected locally.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Now, here's where it gets, as you said, really interesting. The sources highlight massive changes after 1980. This must be where one of those surprising facts comes in.
This was a huge shift, yeah. After the democratic path was interrupted in 1980, there was a move towards more centralized control.
Right.
And one of the most dramatic consequences was in metropolitan areas. There was this radical restructuring. Huge numbers of smaller local governments were simply dissolved.
Dissolved.
Just gone.
Merged into bigger ones.
Gone as separate legal entities, yeah.
Yeah.
Merged into larger municipal structures.
How many are we talking about? Was it nationwide?
It was widespread,
Yeah.
especially affecting areas around the big cities. The sources indicate this was driven by, well, rapid population growth and huge migration from rural areas.
Overwhelming the smaller places.
Completely. They couldn't cope with the demand for services, lighting, water, sewage, transport. They couldn't manage development effectively. The 6360 law, enacted in 2014, was really the culmination of this. It dissolved the legal status of thousands of villages and towns. Thousands, and merged them into these newly expanded metropolitan municipalities. The sheer scale of the reduction in the number of local government units across the country was, well, pretty dramatic. The sources don't give a single total figure for dissolved units across all reforms, but the impact on the local governance map was immense.
Wow, that's a fundamental reshaping. So what does that mean for the structure of local administration in Turkey today? What does it look like now?
Today, based on that unitary structure and the organizational principles, the sources outline two main types of local administration: il usul idaresi, or special provincial administration,
Okay.
and belediye, or municipalities. Villages, or koylar, were a third type historically, but with recent changes like that 6360 law, many have effectively become neighborhoods within larger municipalities. They've lost their distinct legal status in those metro areas.
Let's break down the usul idaresi first. Special provincial administration, what role do they play?
Okay, an el usul idaresi is a public legal entity. It's set up to meet the common local needs, specifically of the people in a province.
The whole province.
The whole province, yeah. It has an elected provincial assembly that makes decisions. And, importantly, it has some level of administrative and financial autonomy granted by law.
And their lineage, where did they come from?
They actually trace back to the Ottoman era, too, specifically the 1864 provincial regulation. They were refined through later laws, and the current basis is a 2005 law.
But you mentioned that big change from the 6360 law. How did that affect them?
Yes, this is where it gets a bit tricky. That 2014 law dissolved the il usul idaresi in the 30 provinces that were designated as metropolitan municipalities.
So they just don't exist in those 30 provinces anymore.
Their operational structure was removed, yes. So while they legally exist based on the law that creates a province, They don't function in about half the country's provinces, the ones that are metropolitan areas. They do continue to function in the provinces that are not metropolitan municipalities.
Okay, so where they do exist, how are they funded? Where does the money come from?
They draw revenue from various places, provincial taxes and fees. They get a share of the general state budget, payments from central government bodies, income from their own assets.
Like property they own?
Exactly. They also collect service fees, get interest or penalties, and the sources mentioned they can even issue bonds to fund projects, although there are limits based on their budget income.
And what are some of their main jobs? What do they actually do?
Key duties include reviewing strategic plans and budgets submitted by the provincial governor, making decisions on expropriation for projects in their work program, approving budget transfers within certain limits, and resolving some administrative disputes.
All right, let's move on to Billediler, the municipalities. These are probably the most familiar form of local government for most people, right?
They definitely are.
What?
The general definition applies. Public legal persons, established by law, elected decision-making bodies, aimed at meeting the common local needs of urban residents.
What does the structure look like inside a typical municipality?
Okay, at the core is the Beledai Maclisi, the municipal council. This is the elected body.
The local parliament, sort of?
Kind of, yeah. It sets the municipality's strategic plan and approves its budget. They have to form specific commissions, too, for planning, budget, zoning, things like that.
And then there's the mayor?
Then there's the Belediye Başkanı, the mayor, also elected. They're the executive head. The mayor prepares plans, manages the administration day to day.
Can they start businesses?
They can even establish municipal companies, yeah. Though the source notes, this needs presidential permission now, and they have to follow public procurement rules if the municipality owns over 50%.
Which could lead to issues.
Well, the source hints at potential tensions between, political appointments in these companies versus strict efficiency goals.
Right.
Mayors are also heavily involved in urban transformation projects. These need a significant land area and a council majority vote. And there's an emphasis on reaching agreement during expropriation for these projects, with related court cases getting priority.
Okay, council, mayor, any other key parts?
There's also the Beledai Incumini, the municipal committee. It's a smaller body, kind of like an executive committee, whose specific duties vary depending on the municipality's size and type. It assists the mayor and council.
How do municipalities bring in money? What are their revenue sources?
Several streams. Property tax is a big one.
Ah, property tax.
Yeah, but the source points out something interesting. In metropolitan areas, this tax goes entirely to the district municipalities, not the main metro one.
Okay, that's important. What else?
There's also an environment cleaning tax, various other local taxes and fees, participation fees.
Participation fees?
Yeah, fees levied on property owners for specific infrastructure work that directly benefits them, like new water lines or sidewalks. They also get tariffs for services like water and other fees set by the council for things they provide.
And borrowing. Can they take out loans for big projects?
Yes, they have borrowing capacity, both domestically and internationally. The forces actually mention examples like the Ankara municipality issuing international bonds.
So they can access global markets?
Sometimes, yes. But borrowing is subject to approval tiers based on the amount relative to their income, and they have to stick to debt limits. Interestingly, the sources note that domestic bond issuance hasn't always been that successful for Turkish municipalities historically. Maybe due to market conditions or other factors, it's not entirely clear.
Okay, let's talk about the big ones. Büyükşehir Belediyeleri, metropolitan municipalities. These are distinct, right? A special category.
They are. The Constitution actually allows for a special administrative structure for large cities, and these metropolitan municipalities are that structure.
And how are they created?
Their establishment is specifically by law, passed by the national parliament. This reflects their strategic importance. It's different from regular municipalities, which used to be established by government decree, though now they generally require law, too.
And that 6360 law we keep mentioning, what did that do specifically to the metro municipalities?
This was the defining change. The law expanded the boundaries of these metropolitan municipalities to cover the entire provincial boundary.
The whole province, even rural areas.
The whole province. This meant all the district municipalities within that province became metropolitan district municipalities. And crucially, thousands of villages and smaller town municipalities inside those provincial borders. Their legal status was dissolved. They were converted into neighborhoods reporting to the district municipalities. It created these huge, sprawling urban-rural governance units.
So it's a two-tiered system within these massive expanded borders.
Exactly. You've got the main metropolitan municipality covering the vast provincial area, and then beneath it, you have the metropolitan district municipalities. The main metro municipality has coordinating functions across this large area, especially for services that span multiple districts, like major transport or infrastructure.
What's unique about their structure or functions then compared to a regular municipality?
Well, their council members are actually drawn from the district councils within the metro area. So district council members also sit on the metro council.
Ah, indirect election.
In a way, yeah. They also have mandatory special commissions like other municipalities, but some are particularly important given their scale zoning, environment and health, planning and budget, and transport are key ones mentioned.
Transport seems crucial for a huge area.
Absolutely. The source specifically highlights the Ilushum Coordinacion Merkezi, UCOME, the Transport Coordination Center. This body is vital for coordinating all kinds of transport across the entire metro area. Its membership includes appointees, representatives from relevant public bodies, professional chambers, transport federations, and the district mayors.
Any specific revenue streams just for the metropolitan municipalities?
Yes, they have some unique ones, like getting a share of the entertainment tax collected in their area and taxes or fees collected within facilities they operate, like bus stations or wholesale markets.
And budgeting. How does that work with the two tiers?
This is interesting. The budgets for the main metropolitan municipality and all its district municipalities are submitted together to the Metropolitan Council. They're approved jointly as a single consolidated budget.
Wow, that must require a lot of coordination.
You'd think so, yes. A huge amount of coordination.
That gives us a really clear picture of the Turkish structure, especially those, well, really dramatic recent changes. Now, let's try and zoom out. How do these local structures connect to bigger global trends that are reshaping our world?
Okay, one of the most impactful trends, obviously, is urbanization. It's its fundamental historical link, right? As agriculture got more efficient, people moved to urban centers.
And the numbers here are just staggering, according to the sources you share.
They really are. Look at this. In 1950, only 30% of the world lived in urban areas.
Less than a third.
Less than a third. By 2014, that was 54%, over half. And the projection for 2050, 66%.
Two-thirds of humanity.
Two-thirds of humanity living in cities or towns within, your lifetime or your children's. That's an expected increase of 2.4 billion urban residents by mid-century.
Billion.
Billion. This isn't just growth. It's creating what the source called a global urban system, where cities themselves are interconnected and powerful nodes in the global network.
And this huge urban population is concentrated in certain regions.
Yes, definitely. Asia-Pacific is already home to almost half, 47% of the world's urban dwellers. Then comes Latin America and the Caribbean at 13%. Then Africa at 12%. Europe, North America, the Middle East, West Asia, and Eurasia together make up the remaining 28%. This massive global shift puts immense pressure and responsibility squarely on local governments.
The sources also discuss regionalization. How does that concept tie into this? Is it different from local government?
Yeah, regionalization here is seen mainly as an administrative concept. It's distinct from political regionalism, which might involve more autonomy or identity politics.
So administrative regionalization.
It's essentially another flavor of decentralization. More powers and resources are delegated to units larger than traditional municipalities, but smaller than the central state, these regions.
And this became popular.
We saw a definite rise in this in Europe, particularly after the 1970s decentralization wave. Countries like Spain, Italy, France really started empowering their regions more.
What were the drivers behind this trend? Why create these regional bodies?
The sources list several reasons. A desire to protect ethnic or religious minorities and distinct local identities sometimes played a role, making administration more efficient across larger functional areas, like an economic basin, helping with national planning and distributing power.
Enhancing democracy.
Yes, enhancing participatory democracy at a regional level too, providing flexibility compared to, rigid central control, and establishing new networks for accountability and sharing information.
And the link to Turkey here, was regionalization purely an internal development, or were there outside influences?
The source is actually quite specific on this. It states that the most significant regionalization developments in Turkey since the 1990s were heavily influenced by the European Union accession process.
Ah, the EU connection?
Exactly. The EU's focus on strengthening institutional and administrative capacity at all levels, national, regional, and local, to implement EU policies effectively, directly shaped Turkey's reform efforts in this area. The EU acted as a major catalyst for exploring and implementing regional structures, like the development agencies.
Development agencies.
Yeah, these were set up based on specific statistical regional classifications, the NTS system, which were harmonized with the EU specifically for planning and funding purposes.
Okay, let's delve a bit deeper then into the European experience the sources describe, particularly around the welfare state period.
Right. European urban history is deeply tied up with industrialization and technology. But a key period for local government was definitely the welfare state era, roughly post-World War II up to the mid-1970s, especially in Western Europe.
This was a time of heavy public intervention, right? Lots of government spending.
Absolutely. The state was intensely involved in the socioeconomic sphere. This was fueled by rapid economic growth at the time. The sources even give examples. Public spending as a percentage of GDP just soared in countries like Germany, the UK, the Netherlands between 1950 and 1975.
And cities and local governments were central to delivering these welfare services.
Crucially so. Think about it. Many core welfare services, like education, health, housing, are delivered primarily in cities. So local governments became essential organizers of collective consumption, as the source puts it. They were the ones providing these vital services.
And this meant local government grew.
Grew rapidly, yeah.
Yeah.
More staff, bigger budgets, more power. This happened across OECD countries during this period. There was a clear rationale: shift responsibilities downwards, because local governments were seen as closer to the problems, more aware of local needs, and thus better able to deliver services effectively.
But then the system hit a crisis in the mid-1970s. Things changed.
Yes, the economic crisis of the mid-70s, the oil shocks and so on, led to a gradual dismantling of that full welfare state model. Budgets got tighter.
And local governments felt the pinch.
Definitely. Local government spending power was often cut, frequently by reducing the grants they received from the central government. And we started to see power shifting back towards the center in some places. The UK is cited as a clear example, with the central government announcing cuts to local spending and passing legislation that increased central influence over local affairs.
And this decline of the welfare state model, this crisis, gave rise to the concept of governance, a different way of thinking about local administration.
Precisely. As that service state model for local government faced a crisis, governance emerged as a new concept. It represents a shift away from local government purely as a provider of services or collective consumption, towards a model that also prioritizes economic production and accumulation, competing for investment, jobs, growth.
How is this governance approach different in practice?
Well, it's defined by being multi-actor. It involves not just local government, but also the private sector, civil society organizations, community groups.
So collaboration instead of just top-down.
Exactly. Hierarchy is replaced by interaction, negotiation, partnerships among these different actors. The state's role shifts too. It becomes less the sole provider and more of a regulator, a facilitator, creating the environment for these different players to interact and deliver services or drive local development.
The sources mention market-oriented decentralization reforms in some European countries as part of this shift.
Yes, countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, France adopted elements of this. The key features listed include things like sharing responsibilities with non-governmental bodies, using private sector competition for service delivery.
Contracting out,
Yeah. Linking payment more directly to services received, increasing customer choice where possible, promoting more individual or private provision of certain services, using more flexible labor practices within public bodies, adopting a more business-like management style, and emphasizing accountability not just upwards, but also to the market and other stakeholders.
Was this shift seen as entirely positive? Did it solve all the problems?
Well, the source points out a potential downside. This increased competition, this focus on attracting investment, can really benefit cities that already have more resources, more capacity.
Leaving others behind.
Potentially, yes. It could leave less fortunate cities or regions struggling to compete, possibly exacerbating urban and regional inequality.
The sources also highlight a really important document, the European Charter of Local Self-Government. What's that about?
This is a key text from the Council of Europe, important to note, that's distinct from the EU. It was adopted in 1985, came into force in 1988.
And its main principles.
It establishes fundamental principles for local government autonomy across Europe. It outlines the right, and importantly the means, for local authorities to manage a significant share of public affairs under their own responsibility.
Limiting central interference.
Yes, it sets limits on how much higher authorities can interfere. It specifically states that central support or grants shouldn't erode local discretion or freedom to set policy. It also underscores the necessity of having locally elected bodies, like councils, and emphasizes the legal protection of local government powers within the framework of the rule of law.
And alongside that, the European Urban Charter emphasizes something crucial for you, our listener: public participation.
Absolutely crucial. This charter strongly promotes citizen involvement in local political life. It requires free and democratic local elections, naturally giving the public a decisive role in how their local area is run.
Consultation, too.
Yes, importantly, it mandates consultation on key projects that will affect the community's future. And it specifically stresses the need to ensure youth participation in local decision-making, getting young people involved.
Finally, the EU itself has a specific body for this subnational representation, doesn't it?
Yes, the Committee of the Regions. It's an advisory body. It's made up of local and regional elected representatives from all the EU member states.
And its purpose?
Its main purpose is to ensure that the voices and perspectives of these subnational authorities, cities, regions, are heard and considered when the EU is making policies and decisions, especially in areas that directly affect them, like economic development, social policy, and regional cohesion funding.
That's a great overview of the global context and the European experience. Now let's connect local action directly to those global goals we mentioned earlier, specifically the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Right. The concept of sustainable development itself really gained traction globally at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. That led to Agenda 21.
Agenda 21.
Yeah, it was basically an action plan aiming to balance development needs with environmental protection. Governments were seen as primarily responsible for implementing it, but it really highlighted the essential role of public participation and involvement from NGOs.
And that filtered down to the local level with something called Local Agenda 21.
Exactly. Local Agenda 21, or YG21, as it was often known in Turkey, focused on translating those broad global goals into concrete local action, finding joint solutions for local environmental and development problems, using resources sustainably, working towards improving livability right there in the community.
What was Turkey's experience with this YG21?
Well, Turkey got involved a bit later than some, really picking up steam after hosting the big UN Habitat 2 conference in Istanbul in 1996.
Habitat 2.
Yeah. A project starting in late 1997 initially covered 9 cities, then it expanded to 23. And by 2004, it had become a broader program involving over 50 local governments across the country.
And what were the aims of YG21 in Turkey?
The aims were quite ambitious, according to the source. Things like fostering active citizenship consciousness, building multi-partner governance networks, bringing together local government, civil society, universities, the private sector, and generally strengthening participation, local democracy, and trying to build a culture of consensus on local issues.
And the current global framework that replaced Agenda 21 effectively is the SDGs.
Yes, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they came into effect in January 2016. They're guiding the work of the UN Development Program, UNDP, and countless governments and organizations for 15 years, up to 2030.
And local governments are key.
Absolutely critical, because so many of the 17 goals have targets that are directly relevant to urban and local life. Everything from poverty and health to clean water, inequality, sustainable cities, climate action. It all happens somewhere, locally.
Let's touch on some specific SDGs mentioned in the sources and how they connect locally, or maybe some interesting data points they shared. First up, poverty and hunger, goals 1 and 2.
Okay. These are obviously deeply local issues. The source points out that agriculture is the largest employer globally, supporting 40% of the population.
And small farms are key.
Hugely key. It mentions 500 million small farms provide something like 80% of the world's food supply, particularly in developing countries. This emphasizes the need to rethink food systems and support these smallholders. That's often a local government concern through things like rural development programs or improving market access for local producers.
And the data on poverty.
Data shows progress on overall poverty reduction in many developing countries, which is good news. But the poorest populations, the most vulnerable, still need urgent, targeted support. And local initiatives, local safety nets, can often help deliver that support more effectively.
Okay, goal 3. Good health and well-being.
Dramatic progress has been made globally, especially in reducing child deaths since 1990. That number has plummeted.
But still challenges.
Huge challenges remain. The source points out a really harsh reality. Millions of children still die before they reach age 5, and this is disproportionately happening in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Poverty and lack of education, especially for mothers, are directly linked to higher child mortality rates.
Any success stories mentioned?
Yes, measles vaccination alone is credited with saving over 15 million lives between 2000 and 2013, a huge public health success, often delivered through local clinics.
And there were those quite specific and sobering data points on HIV/AIDS.
Yes, globally, significant progress has been made in getting people onto life-saving antiretroviral treatment and reducing the number of new infections overall. However, the source presents a truly shocking fact. AIDS is now the leading cause of death globally for adolescents aged 10 to 19.
Leading cause for teenagers.
Leading cause, especially affecting adolescent girls. And this is linked, the source says, to deep-seated issues of gender inequality, sexual violence, lack of bodily autonomy, and limited access to sexual and reproductive health services and education.
So it's not just medical, it's social.
It's deeply social. Addressing these underlying factors, often at the community level through education, empowerment programs, and accessible health services, is absolutely crucial if we're going to meet the target of ending these epidemics by 2030. Local public health services and social support systems have a direct role here.
Goal 6. Clean water and sanitation. Always a big local government responsibility.
A huge one. And the data really shows the scale of the challenge. Over 40% of the world's population already faces water scarcity.
40%.
And projections suggest that by 2050, 1 in 4 people could be living in countries suffering from chronic or recurring water shortages.
What about access now?
Billions have gained access to improved water sources and sanitation facilities since 1990, which is progress. But hundreds of millions still lack access to safe drinking water, and billions, literally billions, lack basic sanitation facilities like toilets. Plus, there's the issue of wastewater. Over 80% globally is discharged untreated into rivers or seas. Managing water infrastructure, ensuring safe supply, treating wastewater, these are core local government functions directly tied to this global goal.
Okay, goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. This seems like the absolute heart of it for local government.
It absolutely is. This is where local governments live and breathe. They're central to urban transport planning and provision, needing to prioritize efficient public transport, make cities walkable and bikeable, ensure accessibility for people with disabilities.
And planning the city itself.
Critically important, they control spatial planning, making the master plans, the zoning plans. This is critical because these plans directly affect property rights and land value. This is where the source mentions the concept of rent.
Right, rent. Can you unpack that a bit more simply? What does it mean in this context?
Sure. Rent, in this urban context, basically refers to the unearned increase in land or property value. It's the value that goes up not because the owner did anything, built something, improved it, but because of external factors, usually government actions or general growth. Like the city decides to rezone nearby land for commercial use instead of residential, making your plot more valuable, or they build a new metro line station down the street. Or simply the city grows, demand increases, and land becomes scarce. That increase in value, driven by collective action or societal change rather than individual effort, is the rent.
And local governments control the decisions that create this.
Often, yes. They control the planning and zoning decisions that can generate huge amounts of this land value uplift. How that value is captured or not captured for public benefit versus just enriching private landowners is a massive issue in urban development and finance, and a source of major political debate and potential corruption. Cities also track key urban indicators like vehicle numbers, traffic congestion, accident rates, direct outputs of urban life that local governments have to manage.
What about housing?
Hugely important under Goal 11 too. Within the broader framework of the right to the city, local governments are key players in trying to ensure everyone has access to adequate housing.
Adequate meaning.
Meaning it's affordable, secure from eviction, livable, safe, decent conditions, accessible physically and to services, and culturally appropriate. Local governments need to promote inclusive housing policies, work with developers, maybe provide social housing, and crucially work to prevent forced evictions.
And finally, Goal 17 emphasizes partnerships. That seems relevant across the board.
Absolutely. This goal basically says that achieving any of the other goals isn't just a job for government alone. It requires collaboration, robust partnerships between the state, the private sector, and civil society, working together at every level from global negotiations right down to local community projects.
Mobilizing resources.
Yes, it includes mobilizing private finance for sustainable investments, think renewable energy, green infrastructure, digital connectivity. And the public sector's role is crucial in creating the right policy environment the regulations, and strengthening oversight to make those partnerships work effectively and fairly.
The sources also discuss localization, specifically in the context of these global agendas. What does that mean?
Localization basically means taking these global frameworks, the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, the new urban agenda agreed at Habitat 3, and using them as blueprints or guides for developing local and regional policies and actions.
Making them relevant locally.
Exactly. Tailoring those big goals to the specific local context. It's about encouraging community ownership of the goals, promoting peer learning and technical assistance between cities, addressing local issues like violence through community-based peace-building efforts.
Culture, too.
Yes, valuing culture as a vital fourth pillar of sustainable development, alongside economic, social, and environmental dimensions. It also means fostering local innovation, supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and ensuring that new technologies are used to support social cohesion, not create bigger divides.
And how is progress on the SDGs actually monitored in a country like Turkey? Who keeps track?
The source indicates that national coordination is handled by the Presidency's Strategy and Budget Directorate. The official statistics needed to measure progress against the SDG indicators are compiled by TÜKE, the Turkish Statistical Institute.
Are all the global indicators tracked?
Many of the global SDG indicators have been integrated into the national statistical system, yes. But the source notes it's an ongoing process, and challenges remain in producing all of them consistently. So work is ongoing to develop alternative or supplementary national indicators where the global ones aren't fully applicable or easily measurable in the Turkish context.
And other local data.
Yeah, they also track other specific local indicators that feed into this broader picture, things like per capita electricity consumption, detailed agricultural production data, livestock numbers, urban water consumption patterns, tourism revenue, and so on.
That really ties the global goals right down to the local level data. Let's look at just a few other interesting concepts the sources brought up that give us different perspectives on how local government works or is thought about. You mentioned bureaucracy earlier.
Yes, the sources briefly touch on some classic ideas about bureaucratic tendencies within public institutions, which can include local governments. One perspective mentioned is that without strong market-like competition, public institutions might have a tendency to grow, maybe beyond optimal efficiency.
And motives.
Well, another idea floated is that individual bureaucrats might sometimes seek larger budgets or more staff, partly as a way to increase their own influence or power within the organization. And ultimately, the argument goes, the citizen bears the cost if this leads to inefficiency. It's a critical perspective on the internal dynamics of large organizations, public or private.
And the economic concept of externalities, how does that play out locally?
This is very relevant at the local level. Externalities are basically costs or benefits of an activity that spill over onto unconnected third parties, people who weren't involved in the original decision or transaction.
Okay, positive ones first.
Positive externalities are spillover benefits. Like if a city builds a beautiful new public park or improves the roads in a neighborhood, the nearby property values might go up. That's a benefit to those landowners, even if they didn't pay directly for the park or road.
And negative.
Negative externalities are spillover costs. The classic example is pollution from a factory impacting the health of nearby residents or damaging the local environment. Those residents bear a cost, even though they weren't involved in the factory's decision to produce or pollute. Local governments often have to step in to manage or regulate these externalities through planning rules, environmental permits, providing public goods like parks, or sometimes imposing taxes or fees on negative externalities.
Geographical indications were another interesting point mentioned.
Yes, this is fascinating and connects directly to local identity and the local economy. A geographical indication, or GI, is essentially a sign or label used on products that have a specific geographic origin and possess qualities or reputation due to that origin.
Like famous local foods.
Exactly. The sources list specific Turkish examples like Malachi apricots, Kayseri ravioli, mantu, Isparta roses, Haraki carpets. Even Turkish coffee is mentioned as potentially fitting this. The place of origin name type is particularly strong. It requires that all the production and processing steps happen in that specific defined geographical area, and the product's unique characteristics are essentially due to that place, its climate, soil, traditional methods, etc.
And this helps the local area.
It can be a powerful tool, yeah, For local economic development, for marketing the place itself, boosting tourism, it protects the reputation and quality associated with that place.
Regional imbalance was mentioned too, linked to those development agencies.
Yes, the sources define this simply as inequality between different regions within the same country. This imbalance can be economic, like big differences in job opportunities or average wages, or social, like unequal access to good quality education, healthcare, or cultural facilities.
Does every country have this?
The source notes that pretty much every country has some level of regional imbalance. In Turkey, the establishment of those development agencies we mentioned earlier, which were aimed at reducing these disparities and promoting development in less developed regions, was underpinned by that statistical regional units classification system, the EBS or NETAS levels, created for EU harmonization. It provided the framework for targeting policies.
And there was a subtle distinction made between local autonomy and local democracy.
Yeah, the sources cite a researcher named Pratchett on this. He suggests thinking of local autonomy as primarily about freedom from interference by higher levels of government or other external influences. It's also about the capacity of a local government to truly reflect the unique local identity or the sort of communal unity of that specific place.
So, different from democracy.
Slightly different from local democracy, which tends to focus more on the mechanisms of self-governance, things like having free and fair elections, systems of representation, channels for citizen participation. Both are obviously important and often linked, but autonomy, in this view, speaks more directly to independence and the expression of local distinctiveness.
Finally, there was the best value approach mentioned from the UK. What was that about?
This came out of that new public management wave we talked about earlier. Best value was a framework implemented in the UK, focused on driving continuous improvement in how local governments deliver public services.
How did it work?
It required local councillors to regularly review all their services, asking fundamental questions about why and how they were being provided. They had to consult with local residents and service users about quality and cost, compare their performance with others, and consider competition. And they were overseen by audit bodies to ensure they were genuinely seeking improvement and delivering, well, best value for the public money spent. It's a very market-influence idea applied directly to public service delivery.
Wow, that was a truly deep dive. We covered so much ground there. We started right at the beginning with those fundamental structures, unitary versus federal states, administrative versus political decentralization.
Yeah. Then we journeyed through Turkey's specific history of local governance, including those really quite dramatic recent changes in the metropolitan areas. We broke down the current structure, the El Özel Adaresi, where they still exist, and the different types of Belediyeler municipalities, including the unique aspects of the Büyükşehir, the metropolitan ones.
And we didn't stop there. We zoomed out, connecting local governance to those massive global trends like urbanization, the whole concept of regionalization, which, as you pointed out, was heavily influenced in Turkey's case by external factors like the EU.
Right, and we drew lessons from that European experience, particularly that big shift from the welfare state model, where local governments were key service providers, to the more complex multi-actor governance model we see more often now. Plus, those important international principles from the European Charter documents.
And then we brought it all together, showing how local governments are absolutely essential players in achieving global goals like the SDGs. Looking at their role in everything from tackling poverty and improving health to managing water, building sustainable cities, and forging partnerships.
And we even touched on some of those key concepts that shape how we think about and analyze local government. Things like bureaucracy, externalities, those fascinating geographical indications, regional imbalances, and different approaches to management and oversight like best value.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a much clearer picture of the complex forces shaping the places where we all live, work, and connect every day. It's clear that local government is far, far more than just, potholes and trash collection.
Absolutely. It's intricately linked to national power dynamics, global challenges, huge economic forces, and even the very identity of our communities that write to the city, that sense of local belonging.
So, considering all these transformations we've discussed, from that welfare state model that put local governments right at the center of service delivery, to the rise of the governance model involving diverse actors and market principles, alongside those significant centralizing shifts we saw in places like Turkey's metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
Here's maybe a question to keep in mind as you look at your own city or town.
How's that balance, the balance between administrative efficiency, genuine local autonomy and identity, and meaningful citizen participation? How is that balance continuing to evolve today, right now, in the face of relentless urbanization and those really pressing global sustainability challenges?
Something to think about.